Hello and welcome back to Deep Sleep Tales. This channel is here to take you away from the fatigue of the day, to mute the sound of time, and to transport you to the quiet, dim corners of another era, another world. Each week, a new story, each story, an invitation to sleep, each word, in the service of tranquility and silence. Tonight, I bring you a story from the depths of Victorian England's winter. As the snowstorm beats against the roofs, I'll tell you about an old portrait a man found in his attic, and how that portrait slowly, silently opened a door that had been closed for years. I will speak of love, pride, misunderstandings, and how time quietly carries itself within a person. So, where are you listening to me tonight? Under the covers, or curled up in your chair wrapped in a blanket? Tell us in the comments section. This is your home too. If these stories bring you peace, if they soften your night a little, you might consider subscribing to Deep Sleep Tales. We're waiting for you. The door is always open. Now, the time has come. Settle yourself comfortably. Let your shoulders drop. Relax your jaw. Adjust your pillow if you have one. Close your eyes, or let them close on their own. Take a deep, slow breath and let it go. Everything that happened today can wait for now. I'll take you to a winter night covered in snow, dimly lit and carpeted in velvety silence. On the 14th day of December 1891, shortly after 9 o'clock in the evening, the heaviest snowstorm of that winter descended upon the small Derbyshire town of Westhaven. The snow had been falling for several hours already, a fine, steady, silent fall, as if the world had emptied itself and this whiteness had begun to spill outwards, with no intention of stopping. But after 9 o'clock, the wind came, and everything changed. The wind wrapped around the town from both sides, howling through the narrow streets, crashing the bare branches of the trees together, and pounding the roofs, windows, and door hinges so hard that those sitting inside their homes put down their glasses, closed their books, or turned to the windows. The stone house at the far end of Fitzwilliam Street stood a little more alone than the others. 3 stories high, built of grayish Portland stone, its facade darkened by years of rain, its shutters painted the color of morning pallor. This house stood silently against the storm. Snow had accumulated on the garden wall. The small iron-barred gate trembled slightly in the wind, but did not open. The oak tree in the garden had long since shed its leaves, its branches skeletal in the darkness, reaching toward the sky, whispering to each other with every gust of wind, dry and low, in a language accumulated over the years. A yellow light seeped out from the single window on the ground floor of the house, a dim, flickering light, a light that seemed extremely modest and vulnerable compared to the fury of the storm, but still a light that burned, still a light that was there. That light came from the study on the first floor. Cornelius Ashworth sat at his desk, his left elbow resting on the dark oak tabletop, his chin buried in his palm, staring at the open notebook before him. His eyes were on the page, but his mind was elsewhere, far beyond the pages, buried beneath the sound of the snow, somewhere within the years. Cornelius was 47 years old. He was tall, once athletic, but now somewhat plump with age, his shoulders still broad, but his posture slightly stooped. His hair was dark gray now, not all of it, which had been chestnut in his youth, but most of it. His face was strong, high cheekbones, deep lines, a square jaw. On the back of his left hand, near the wrist, there was a small scar from his childhood. No one asked about it, and he didn't mention it. But now that face had softened, drawn inward, as if bearing the weight of something. The study was small and cluttered. Against the wall opposite the desk was a bookcase that reached to the floor. The shelves were so full that the books were arranged in 2 rows, the ones behind hidden from view, but present like a second layer. Next to the bookcase, a small fireplace was burning. The logs had been lit hours ago, and most had turned to embers, yet it still gave off a low orange light that spread across the rest of the room, onto the desk, onto Cornelius's face, onto a frameless map on the wall. There was a cup of tea on the desk. It had gone cold. Cornelius had brewed it about an hour ago, forgotten to drink it, and now the surface of the tea had grown dull, its steam long gone. Next to the cup lay a pencil sharpener, several sheets of filled paper, and a small oval silver tobacco pouch. The pouch was empty, its last tobacco consumed hours ago. Cornelius raised his head as the wind beat against the roof. He listened for a moment. The storm was truly powerful. The tiles on the roof were saying something to each other, and this sound came from above, from the very top of the house, from the floor of the attic, as if that empty space were talking to the storm in a familiar language. Cornelius closed the notebook. He did it slowly, feeling the edges of the pages, lifting the left side first, then lowering the cover onto his right hand. He didn't tie the notebook string, he just closed it and pushed it to the edge of the desk, next to the other papers. Then he leaned back, hands in his lap, and listened to the ceiling. Every year, as the storm pounded the roof like this, he had sat in this room, heard this sound, and done nothing. Every year the snow had come, the wind had howled, the house had shaken, and he had sat there, with his book or notebook, and waited for morning. But tonight something was different. Not in the sound of the storm, perhaps, but something inside him was different. It wasn't exactly restlessness, it was something quieter, calling him upward, an impulse that wasn't necessary, but that he couldn't turn his back on. The attic. When had he last been up there? It had been years, maybe 5 years, maybe more. The house was part of the inheritance left to him. His Aunt Dorothea had left it to him before she died, and when Cornelius moved in, he had opened the attic door once, looked into its darkness, and closed it again. It was filled with the remnants of another time, his aunt's belongings, trunks, covered furniture, and everything that a house of that age should have accumulated, but had been left forgotten because no one wanted to see it. Cornelius got up. He did this slowly too, first supporting himself on the table, then standing up, noticing the stiffness in his knees. He had been sitting for a long time. He walked over to the fireplace, looked at the embers for a moment. The orange light hit his face, and the lines on his face softened for a moment with the ancient play of the fire. Then he turned and walked to the door. The study door was an old, reliable door. Its yellow brass knocker felt sweetly cold and heavy in the hand, and as the door opened, it made a very slight, almost whisper-level creak. The corridor was dark. Cornelius picked up the small metal lamp on the right and took out his lighter. When the wick lit, the hallway suddenly came into being, the unpainted patches on the walls, the cracks in the wooden floor. The old picture frame on the left side became visible. The picture was blurry, a landscape painting whose colors had faded in this hallway, standing in the same place for years, where natural light never reached. Cornelius had never examined it. He didn't examine it now either. He just passed by it. He reached the stairs. These stairs leading from the first floor to the second were not wide. The wood was slightly darkened, parts of the banister worn, the centers of the steps hollowed out by decades of footsteps. Cornelius began climbing the stairs, holding the banister with his right hand, stepping carefully on each step, raising the lamp in his left hand slightly. On the second floor there were 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. Cornelius slept here, in the large bedroom with its window facing the street, but he didn't go in there now. He walked to the end of the hallway, hearing the sound of the wooden floor with each step, noticing how the shadow from the lamp played on the walls. At the very end of the hallway, on the right, was the door to the attic. This door was different from the others. It was narrower, lower, and closed with a mechanism that required the arm to be raised. There was no lock on it, but it hadn't been opened in a long time, and this long period of closure had given the door a weight, as if it had a will of its own, neither locked nor inviting, just waiting. Cornelius stopped and looked at the door. He reached out his hand. The metal mechanism was cold beneath his fingers. Even though the house was warm, the end of this corridor was cold, and that cold had passed into the door. He lifted the mechanism. There was a click, and the door, under its own weight, opened about a centimeter. Cold air descended from above. Not exactly winter cold, the damp, musty cold of a closed, unventilated space. First came the smell of old paper, wooden crates, fabrics untouched for years, then something else beneath it, that sharp, sweet smell unique to time itself. Cornelius breathed it in. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't overpowering, it was just old. The smell of many, many years accumulated. He opened the door fully. Behind it was not exactly a staircase, more like a steep wooden platform with steps, 12 or 13 steps, leading upward into the darkness. He lifted the lamp and looked. The floor of the attic was visible, dirty wood covered with a thin layer of dust, and on the left side, the corner of a large dark-colored chest. Cornelius took a deep breath, slowly and quietly. Then he took his first step onto the step. The attic was larger than expected, or perhaps it just felt that way at that moment, as the yellow light from the lamp bounced off the walls and back, shadows deepening in the corners, the roof above appearing higher than anticipated. The floor was wooden and creaked with every step, deep, weary sounds as if it hadn't had to bear anyone's weight for a very long time, and didn't like having to remember that burden again. Cornelius walked slowly, holding his lamp slightly above him, scanning the area. On the left side stood a row of trunks, large, dark wooden trunks with rusted metal clasps. The lid of the largest one was slightly warped, its corner lifted. It was impossible to tell what was inside, but that warped corner carried a breath of the past. On the right were a few pieces of furniture covered with thick cloth, a chair, a small table, and behind it another object of indeterminate shape. In the middle were scattered boxes, a pile of yellowed newspapers, and something inside a laurel-colored sack, the contents unknown. The storm was much more intense here. The roof beams groaned slightly under the pressure of the wind, a low, constant sound, too light to damage the house, but too persistent to ignore. Snow hit the roof, a thin crystalline sound, but so many flakes fell that this thin sound accumulated into a hum. Cornelius stood in the middle and looked around. He still didn't know exactly why he had come. He hadn't come to look for anything, or so he thought, but his feet had brought him here, and now he was here, in the cold, holding the lamp, listening to the sound of the storm. He walked toward the right corner. He passed the covered furniture. First the armchair became clearer, then the small round table behind it. But the object behind, the one at the very back, covered with a slightly shifted cloth, one corner exposed, rectangular and standing upright, slowed Cornelius's steps for a moment. A wooden frame was visible from the open corner of the cover, a dark carved frame, and from under the frame, barely visible, a piece of canvas that had slowly turned brown. Cornelius stopped. He stood there for a moment, not holding his breath, but slowing his breathing, just looking. Then he moved forward. He took his lamp in his left hand, grabbed the corner of the cover with his right hand, and pulled, slowly, gently, as if he didn't want to wake something sleeping beneath the cover. The cover slid away. Some dust rose into the air. Cornelius coughed a little and held his lamp to the side. The painting was revealed. It was a portrait, about 50 centimeters wide, 70 centimeters high, painted in rich, deep colors. The frame was thick and carved, arabesque motifs at the corners, vine branches along the edges, and inside the painting, a woman. Cornelius raised the lamp in his hand, held it a little higher, and looked. The woman was seated, her face turned slightly to the side, her gaze directed somewhere outside the painting, as if she had been caught thinking of something very distant at that moment. Her hair was dark chestnut, part of it gathered up, part of it falling down her neck, and that falling part was so natural that it felt as if the painter had placed it there not to paint it, but simply because he had seen it. Her dress was navy blue, with a small brooch on the collar, and her face. Cornelius's right hand reached out, unconsciously, toward the frame of the painting. His fingers touched the wooden frame. The frame was cold, winter cold, attic cold, but there was something beneath it, or so Cornelius felt, a warmth that had passed through the wood, through the paint, waiting for many long years, now recognized. He slid his fingers along the frame, slowly, over each carved motif, down to the lower right corner. In the lower right corner, there was a signature written in small letters with a brushstroke. A. Blackmore, 1869. Cornelius closed his eyes. Something stirred inside him, a movement more felt than heard, like the sound of a heavy object that had remained in one place for years and was now shifting slightly. Then he opened his eyes and looked again. Evangeline. 22 years had passed. In the spring of 1869, Cornelius Ashworth was 25 years old and had just completed his law studies in London. Back then, Cornelius was a completely different person, or so he thought now, in the attic, in the cold, holding the lamp in his hand. Back then, being young wasn't just a matter of age, it was a matter of posture, a way of walking, that easy energy felt upon waking in the morning, and the unquestioned confidence carried throughout the day that every door would open for him. Back then, Cornelius walked fast, his coat would flap in the wind, and he didn't care. He'd tip his hat, but running never crossed his mind. London seemed huge to Cornelius that year. For someone coming from the narrow streets and quiet mornings of Westhaven, London's noise, smell, crowds, and vastness surprised him anew every morning. The damp wind from the Thames carried everything on it all day long: fish and iron and fresh printing, ink and the mixed smell of thousands of people. Cornelius wanted to swallow it all, to know it all, to touch it all, but London was temporary. His education was over, and Cornelius's plan was to open a small law office connected to his father's practice in Derbyshire and Westhaven, or in one of the nearby towns. That was his father's wish. Cornelius's own desire seemed unclear at the time. It was not a clear, determined desire, but rather a trace softened within his father's desire, intertwined with it, easily traceable. He would stay in London until summer, a few more months, and during those few months, one Tuesday afternoon, among the shelves of a library near Charing Cross, he would meet Evangeline Blackmore. It was late May, a Tuesday afternoon. Cornelius had been to this library before. It was a familiar place, the narrow entrance, the wooden ceiling beams, the librarian watching the ladder used to reach the high shelves, and the rugs laid out in front of each shelf, varying in thickness. The library had its own scent: old paper, leather bindings, a little dust, and the faint sweet steam of the librarian's linden tea, brewed every morning, wafting from the far corners. Cornelius would inhale that scent with his first step, and slow down a little each time, unconsciously but always. Cornelius was looking for a legal text. He walked between the shelves. He raised his finger to his eyelashes to read the spines, slowed his steps, tilted his head to the side. When he reached a shelf, he stopped. The book he was looking for was on the top shelf. It wasn't at a height he could reach. He had to stretch a little. He reached out. His fingers touched the spine of the book, pulled. The book came, but so did the one next to it, and they slid forward together. Cornelius grabbed the other book, but he couldn't quite hold it. It slipped through his fingers, hung in the air for a moment, then fell. He bent down to pick it up, and at that very moment, someone else bent down from the other side. Two hands reached for the same book at the same time. Their hands touched. Their fingers remained on the same book for a moment, neither pulled back nor continued to hold, just paused. Cornelius raised his head. There was a woman in front of him, bent over, like him, her head slightly bowed, but at that very moment raising her head, opening her eyes, dark chestnut hair, some of it gathered back, but a few strands fell across her cheek. Light green eyes, or were they gray, the kind that changed with the light, now light, almost yellowish in the May sunlight streaming through the window. Her face was neither round nor angular, but something in between, a strong but not harsh face. They looked at each other. Was it a second or less? Cornelius couldn't be sure, but there was something in that look that a few seconds later made him take the book and leave. and the face continued to flicker at the edge of his mind among the pages of the legal text, not as an image, but as a feeling, sticky and light. The woman had put down the book. She had stepped back and bowed slightly, smiling politely. "Here you go," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and calm. Cornelius stood up and said, "Thank you," his face flushing slightly but noticeably as he spoke. Then both of them returned to their own shelves. Cornelius had opened the book on the shelf and was looking at the pages when he noticed his attention had wandered. The arrangement of the words on the pages hadn't changed, but the meaning seemed to have vanished as his eyes scanned the letters. His mind was stuck on another image, on those green-gray eyes, on the hand reaching for the book, on the sound of the word "Here you go." This was nonsense, Cornelius told himself. It was a coincidence, a polite gesture, nothing more. He closed the book and stood in front of the shelf, looking to his right. The woman was still there, 2 shelves away. She had opened a large book and was carefully examining the pages. She was leaning forward slightly. Her height and her attention to what she was seeing were carried in that lean. On one side was a small leather bag, left on the floor. In the daylight opposite the window, her hair had turned a subtle shade of red. Cornelius turned his head the moment he realized she was watching him. He examined the top of the shelf with feigned preoccupation, not knowing what he was looking for, just as if he needed to stay there a little longer. Then he decided to take a step, to leave. "Excuse me," the voice was the woman's. Cornelius turned. She was looking at him, the book still in her hand, but she had turned it slightly, her face toward him. "Are you looking at this shelf?" she said, raising her hand to the shelf above. "This section is trusts and estates, but the one directly below is international proceedings. If you're a law student, which you seem to be." Cornelius smiled at this judgment. "Is it that obvious?" he said. "The way you're looking at the spine of the book makes it obvious," said the woman, and as she said this, her face softened, taking on a sincere expression. Cornelius came to the small pedestal table next to the shelf. The woman was already there. They stood about 5 feet apart and talked. Later, Cornelius would try to remember how long this conversation lasted, what exactly they said. What he could recall was not so much the words themselves as the space between them, the brief silences she left after finishing a sentence and waiting for the next one, her eyes slightly to the side and pensive during those silences, or the moment when she tilted her head slightly to the side and listened while he was speaking. It was as if she was weighing what was being said inside, without any hurry. The woman was Evangeline Blackmore. She was 21 and attended an art school, a classroom above a small studio on the south side of London. She came to the library regularly for resources on anatomy, composition, and color theory. She wasn't from London. She was from Oxfordshire, having come to the city 2 years ago to become a painter. Cornelius paid attention to every detail as he listened. When she said she was a painter, he asked, "Portraits?" And Evangeline replied, "Everything," but added, "Portraits are the hardest." "Why?" "Because a real human face never stays still," Evangeline said. "You think it freezes when you paint it, but it doesn't. You see something different every time you look." Cornelius didn't know then that he would think about this for a long time, but it lodged in a corner of his mind, immediately, quietly, unnoticed. It was past 4 in the afternoon, and the library was about to close. They knew this as the librarian coughed politely and turned to the shelves, but none of them got up. Cornelius stood up. He gathered his book and paused for a moment, not knowing what to say or do next, but feeling that something had to be said. "There's a good tea house nearby," said Cornelius. His voice came out a little more formal than he intended, not tense but careful. "If you have time." Evangeline looked at him for a moment. It wasn't an appraising look, it was a thoughtful look, as if she were weighing the question inside her. A thoughtful look that was in no hurry and in no way uncomfortable. "That was a very kind offer," she said. Her tone was light, but her expression was serious. They stepped out onto the street together. The May sun was still merciful, and the Strand sidewalks carried the long shadows of the afternoon. Cornelius had already forgotten everything he'd had on his mind that morning when he left: the law notes, the planned return dates, the letter he needed to write to his father. The street was there, and Evangeline was beside him, and that was enough. In June, Cornelius decided to leave, but didn't go. The initial decision was made in early June. He had written to his father, informing him that he would postpone his return until July to organize his office. His father had written a brief, understanding reply, but in the last line of the reply he had said, "There must be something important keeping you that I can wait," and Cornelius had read that line 3 times. There was an important matter. That matter was Evangeline Blackmore. Throughout June they met several times a week, sometimes in the library, sometimes in the small garden near Evangeline's studio, sometimes in the tea house. Evangeline carried a sketchbook in that garden, a small black-covered notebook, the paper slightly thicker than a plate, and each time they were together, a few pages of the notebook filled up. Tree branches, passing people, once a profile sketch of Cornelius. When she noticed this, Evangeline closed the sketchbook, not hastily, but with a calm and measured movement, yet she closed it. The cover fell into her palm, and she looked at Cornelius for a moment. Then they talked about something else, as if nothing had happened. That moment of closing it stayed in Cornelius's mind all day. "I want to see that drawing," said Cornelius. "No," said Evangeline, "it's not finished yet." "When will it be finished?" "It may not need to be finished." Evangeline gave answers like this: unfinished but closed, answers with a door but no key. Cornelius would think about them, sometimes for hours, sometimes lying awake staring at the ceiling. In mid-July, Evangeline invited him to the studio. The studio was on a side street in Southwark. It was upstairs in a 2-story stone-fronted building whose ground floor had once been a warehouse. The staircase was outside, narrow and steep, metal. When you climbed it, the door opened and the interior took you in. First came the smell: paint and linseed oil and turpentine and fresh paper, all mingled together, an indivisible but distinct scent, the kind that has a place but no name. In the middle of the studio stood a large easel. The painting on it was covered. On the right wall were shelves, on them tubes of paint, bowls, old brushes left in jars of water. On the left wall was a large window. It faced south and was full of sunshine that day, pouring in through the glass and covering every surface in a golden light. Evangeline didn't show him the easel. Instead, she pointed Cornelius to the chair in front of the window and took a stool herself, sat down, and opened the sketchbook on the table. Cornelius sat down. The sun warmed his back. It fell between his shoulder blades, the honest, direct heat of the morning sun, and something inside him relaxed without him noticing. "I'm going to do something for you," said Evangeline. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if she were stating the most ordinary thing. "Don't watch me." "How can I not watch?" said Cornelius. "Look somewhere else." Cornelius looked out the window. The street was visible, the cars, the passing people. There was a distant bell ringing, and behind it the whisper of a light brushstroke, the rustling of pages, and Evangeline's occasional short, thoughtful breaths. Cornelius remembered this moment now, in the attic. That sun, that sound, the sweetness within the waiting. Their first argument came at the end of July. It was trivial at first, or so Cornelius saw it at first. At a dinner party, Mr. Hargrove, one of Evangeline's teachers, was there. A young but established painter, pleasant-looking, articulate, especially animated, and passionate when discussing art theory. And that evening, as Cornelius watched Hargrove, he felt something vague, nameless but impossible to ignore. When Hargrove looked at Evangeline, something tightened inside Cornelius. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't even admit it to himself that night. But on his way home, walking under the gas lamps of the streets, he knew the name of what he carried inside him now. It was jealousy, simple and meaningless, and unnecessary, but real. An hour after meeting Evangeline the next day, he voiced it, not directly, indirectly, by asking, "Does Hargrove show this much interest in all his students?" Evangeline stopped. Her gaze changed, instantly, clearly. "What do you mean?" she said. "I'm just asking." "No," said Evangeline, her voice calm but with something in it, not real calm, a held calm. "You're asking something else." And they both fell silent. For a minute, maybe two. In the silence, in the middle of the crowded Strand, despite the people flowing between them, they remained in that narrow silence. Then Evangeline walked away and Cornelius followed, and as they parted that day, they both said goodbye in shorter sentences than usual. 3 days passed. Cornelius didn't spend those 3 days shut in his room. He reviewed his law notes, sat in the library, took short walks. But behind everything, on the edge of every page, at the end of every walk, there was that conversation, the bluntness of that question, the change in Evangeline's face, that 2 minute silence. On the fourth day, he went to the workshop door. He stood outside, didn't look at the stairs, just stood. Then he went up. Evangeline opened the door. Her gaze was neither cold nor warm. It was a waiting gaze, wanting to see what would happen. "I was wrong," Cornelius said. He said this at the door. He didn't even step inside. "That question was unfair. I'm sorry." Evangeline looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the door a little wider and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. They went inside, and from that day on, Cornelius tried to control his jealousy. He didn't always succeed, but he tried. At the beginning of August, Evangeline said, "I want to paint you." Cornelius had never mentioned this to Evangeline before. He remembered the days he sat there, of course, at the window, looking out, but those days were sketchbooks, not real work on canvas. This was different. "Why?" said Cornelius. Evangeline thought about it. She really thought about it. She didn't answer right away. "Because there's something in your face," she said finally. "Something I notice when I look at you, but can't quite put into words. I want to try to define it with paint." Cornelius asked when she wanted to do it. "Saturday morning," said Evangeline. They arrived before the sun filled the studio on Saturday morning, and Cornelius sat in front of the window, and Evangeline set up the easel and opened the paint tubes and mixed them, and for a while she just looked at Cornelius, without writing anything, without drawing anything, just looking. Under this gaze, Cornelius stood in a strange place, neither uncomfortable nor at ease, somewhere in between, like someone about to meet the unknown. "You've got me thinking," Evangeline said after a while, reaching for the brush, "about how a portrait can change a person. Does it change them? Sometimes a painting draws something outside the person inward. Sometimes it's the opposite." Cornelius looked out the window. A horse-drawn carriage was passing by, its wheels clattering on the stones. "Which will be true for me?" he asked. Evangeline didn't answer. The brush touched the canvas. The portrait was completed in 4 sessions, 1 hour sessions with long intervals between them. Each session was different. In the first, Evangeline spoke little. Her attention was entirely on the brush and canvas, and Cornelius remained largely silent, looking out the window, listening to the sounds on the street. In the second session, they talked a lot about art, law, Oxford, the difference between town and city, memories, future plans, and the conversation flowed so easily from one topic to another that they couldn't remember where they had started. In the third session, Evangeline cried, very little, just a single tear, slowly rolling down her left cheek. When Cornelius noticed, he fell silent, and Evangeline, without putting down her brush, looked at the canvas and said, "Go on, talk." Her voice was flat, but beneath that flatness, there was something delicate, something fragile. Cornelius spoke, but he couldn't remember what he said later. He only remembered the weight of that moment and the strange beauty within that weight. The portrait was finished in the fourth session. Evangeline stared at the easel for a while, leaning back, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side. Then she turned to Cornelius. "Come and look," she said. Cornelius got up and came to the easel and looked at the painting. It felt strange to see himself, to appear so calm, to project such an inward gaze. The man in the painting was looking at the window, but there was no window in his eyes. There was something else in his eyes, something distant, patient, dissatisfied, but not complaining. "Is this me?" said Cornelius. "It's a part of you," said Evangeline. In the last week of August, Cornelius wrote his father a second letter. He was postponing the arrangement of the law office until September. He didn't explain why. He only said some matters in London took longer than I expected, and this vagueness meant a lot and said very little. That week he walked with Evangeline in Hyde Park. It was early morning, and the park was half empty, the shadows under the trees still long. Autumn was just around the corner. The tips of the leaves were beginning to turn chestnut brown, and in the morning air, the daylight now faded more quickly, feeling short and precious. Evangeline carried a small bag with her. Inside were a sketchbook and a few pencils, out of habit. As they walked, she would stop occasionally, take a pencil from her pocket, and draw something. Then they would walk again. Cornelius wanted to say something to her that day. There was something ready inside him, not exactly words, but a decision, a desire, a wish to open up, but he didn't say it. He put it off until later, until the next meeting, or a more appropriate moment. The right moment was always just a little way off. At one point, Evangeline said, "Will you be back before winter?" Her voice was light, and she asked the question as she walked, without turning to look back. "I don't know," said Cornelius. "Are you staying?" "I'm continuing. I continue as I learn." There was something in that answer, both yes and no, both an invitation and independence. Cornelius couldn't quite figure it out at that moment, but he carried it with him until the air turned cold. As they left the park, a leaf fell, chestnut brown, spinning, and neither of them looked, but both heard it. September arrived and London changed. The lightness of summer receded not suddenly, but noticeably, morning by morning, and a layer of cold settled beneath the air, ushering in a season where even the afternoons were a little grayer. The leaves began to change color, and the daylight seemed shorter and more precious. Cornelius noticed these things. When he looked out his window in the morning, he noticed the tone of the sky, the weight of the people on the streets, the way he held his teacup a little longer in his hand. The season was saying that something was approaching, not with words, but in an understandable language. The third letter from his father arrived. This letter was different from the previous ones. It was short, clear, and direct. "I'm paying the rent for the office starting in November. I expect you to be there." His father ended the letter with, "The office was big. It couldn't be run alone, and your mother asked," 2 words. But those 2 words sat on the table for 3 days. Above everything else, the cover open. Cornelius left the letter on the table for 3 days. On the third day, he met Evangeline and mentioned the letter. It was a cool September afternoon, with a breeze from the south. The bench in the north corner of Hyde Park was wet from the light rain that morning, and the two of them sat down, drying the surface of the bench with a handkerchief. Cornelius recounted the letter, not directly but in summary. His father's expectation, the office being ready, the inevitability of November. Evangeline listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask for clarification, just listened and occasionally looked at Cornelius's face. When Cornelius finished, there was silence. "You're going," Evangeline said. It wasn't a question. "I have to go," Cornelius said. "That's not the same thing." Cornelius bowed his head. "No, it's not," he said, "but the result is the same." Evangeline continued to watch him. There was no sadness or anger on her face. There was something deeper, something that burned more slowly. "Before I go," Cornelius said slowly, and paused. "Yes," said Evangeline. Cornelius looked at her. "Before I go, I want to ask you something." Evangeline waited. If Cornelius began and paused again, the words scattered in that moment, the sentences he thought he had prepared, did not come out. The thing inside him was still there, but the words couldn't bridge the gap, or perhaps they didn't want to in that moment. "Next spring," he said finally, "if I come back, would you allow it?" Evangeline looked at him for a moment. Then she said softly, "Is that a question?" "It's a question," said Cornelius. A long silence. Leaves were falling in the park, silently, without asking, just falling. "Come," Evangeline said finally. "When spring comes, come." A week later, in the first days of October, when he went to Evangeline's studio one evening, Hargrove was inside. The door was open. Cornelius had climbed the stairs, knocked. Evangeline had said, "Come in," and he had entered. Hargrove was examining a painting on an easel, standing in the middle of the studio, and Evangeline was behind him, sketchbook in hand, telling him something. Hargrove had been in Paris last month. He had seen a new gallery, received an invitation to a new exhibition. His voice was animated as he spoke, his hands gesturing once. The two turned. Hargrove greeted them politely. They shook hands. Evangeline greeted them politely too, but there was something in her eyes, a slight tension stemming from the presence of something she shouldn't have known about. Difficult to define, but palpable. Cornelius came in and sat down and tried to join the conversation. Hargrove's Paris story, the new exhibition invitation, the possibility of Angeline's work being considered by a gallery. But that old feeling came back, the feeling he couldn't control, couldn't silence with logic. When Hargrove turned to Evangeline while talking, something tightened in Cornelius's chest, small but insistent, and this time it didn't go away. He knew that later, he didn't know it then, but it didn't go away. After Hargrove left, Cornelius said, "When will you decide?" Evangeline looked back. Decide what? Paris. Evangeline put down her notebook. "That's my decision," she said. "I know. Then why are you asking?" Cornelius said nothing. What he wanted to say was swirling inside him, but it didn't want to come out, because once it came out, it would be heard, and once heard, it couldn't be taken back. "I think you're going," he said finally. "Maybe I will," said Evangeline. "Why does that concern you?" And Cornelius made a mistake. He didn't know it at the time, but later, years later, in the attic in front of the portrait, he knew he had made a mistake. "Because," said Cornelius, his voice coming out harsher than he intended, "if you go, the promise you made for this spring goes too." The silence settled so heavily that the room seemed to shrink. Evangeline looked at him. Her gaze was long and layered. Surprise, not quite anger, but something close to it, and at the bottom, deep down, hurt. "What is this?" Evangeline said. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was steel in it. Cornelius did not answer. "Did you make it conditional on a decision of mine?" Evangeline said. "No," Cornelius said. "I was just—" "You know what you said," Evangeline said. She paused. Then she continued, slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I am never obligated to account to you. Where I go, whose invitation I accept, those are my decisions. You know that?" "I know," said Cornelius. And this time he really knew, which was precisely why something inside him was crumbling. Evangeline turned back to the table. She gathered her notebook. "I want to leave tonight," she said. Cornelius stood up. He wanted to apologize, a full and true apology, not small but big, proportional to the damage he had seen, but his mouth opened and closed, and then he only said, "I understand." He went down the stairs. He stepped out onto the street. The October cold hit his face. 3 days passed, and he didn't write a letter. 5 days passed, and he walked past the workshop, but didn't go up the stairs. 7 days passed, and he went to the library, sat down, opened a book, and closed it. 9 days passed, and he wrote a letter to his father. "I'll be back in November," he said. On the 10th day, he went to the workshop. He knocked on the door. He waited. He knocked a second time. The door didn't open. He went downstairs, and there was a grocery store next door. The grocer said, "Miss Blackmore has been traveling a lot this week." Cornelius returned and wrote a letter. It was a short letter. There was an apology in it, a real apology, just one paragraph. At the end of the letter, he said, "If possible, I would like to see you before I leave." There was no reply. On the 4th of November, Cornelius left London. The train station was crowded with the morning rush, porters carrying suitcases, children running between platforms, couples walking arm in arm. White steam rose from the locomotive. In the cold November air, this steam hung in place for a long time, remaining in sheets rather than dispersing. Cornelius walked to the end of the platform. He turned and scanned the platform. It wasn't out of habit, but out of hope. But Evangeline wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. Why would she be? She hadn't even replied to his letter. He boarded the train. He looked out the window. The platform slowly receded. The station's broad roof receded. London's silhouette in the fog receded. November fields passed by the window, grayish, flat, slightly undulating in the mist. Cornelius looked for a while, then withdrew his gaze and put his hand in his coat pocket. In his pocket was a small round object. It was a ring, a small, simple gold ring. He had bought it in August. He hadn't quite found the courage to ask, hadn't quite been able to say anything, and the ring had been carried in his pocket ever since, bearing the silent weight of the unasked question. His fingers tightened around the ring. The train moved on, and the years passed. How years pass, large within a person and silently without. Cornelius returned to Westhaven and became a lawyer like his father. He opened an office, took cases, returned home in the evenings, woke up in the mornings. He was a good lawyer, attentive, meticulous, believing in justice, but not idealizing it. His town respected him, and Cornelius loved his town, its quiet harmony, its familiar faces, the rhythm of each season. But he never married. His relatives asked, his mother, his friends, and with age society's silent but insistent expectation. Cornelius always gave polite answers. No time, or not yet, or he just laughed and changed the subject. Once his mother had insisted at dinner, across the table, and Cornelius had said, "One day maybe," and his mother had looked at him, long and hard. Then they had talked about something else. He heard nothing about Evangeline. He didn't know if she had gone to Paris. There was a feeling of defeat in this search, even years later, or perhaps especially years later. When his Aunt Dorothea died, Cornelius inherited this house and moved in. He had opened and closed the attic door that first day, and now here he was, 22 years later, with the portrait in his hand. Cornelius stood before the portrait, the lamp in his hand flickering. The hand holding the lamp was slightly tense. He noticed this and consciously relaxed it, opening and closing his fingers one by one. Evangeline's face looked at him from the canvas. 21-year-old Evangeline, in the light of 1869, in her navy blue dress, turned to one side, gazing at something in the distance. There was no logical explanation for this painting being here, in his aunt's house, covered up next to this chest, and Cornelius wouldn't think about it for a long time. He wasn't thinking about it now, he was just looking. It was an old sadness, not a fresh sadness, not sharp, not painful. It was a sadness that had settled slowly over the years, its edges softened, taking shape, not hard as stone, soft as wool, heavy but portable. Cornelius knew it. He felt its weight. Every day he carried it within him, no longer even aware it was a weight, so familiar had it become. As the storm beat against the roof, this weight became a little clearer, or perhaps he suddenly realized it, the reality of what he carried, the name of its weight. He looked at the lower left corner of the portrait. On the inside edge of the frame, almost invisible, a small piece of paper was stuck, a paper that had yellowed and browned with time, folded, tucked into the corner. Cornelius reached out his finger and slowly slid the paper out from under the corner. He opened it. It was his Aunt Dorothea's handwriting, shaky, with the tremor of old age, but legible and brief. Just a few lines. "This painting was entrusted to me. Its owner was Evangeline Blackmore. She once lived in Oxfordshire. She asked me to deliver this to you. I don't know you, sir, but someone who knows you said I didn't need to. The words of the person sending this portrait are, tell him that the past belongs not to the sender, but to the receiver. D.A. Cornelius held the paper and finished reading it, then started again and read it once more. 9 years ago. That year his Aunt Dorothea was alive, and that year he had received the portrait, but Cornelius was not here that year. He had only moved here 7 years later, and Dorothea had not told him before she died, or could not have told him, or did not want to tell him. And the portrait had waited, under the cover beside the chest, listening to the sound of the storm. The past belongs not to the sender, but to the receiver. Cornelius turned this sentence over in his mind, once, twice, 3 times. With each turn, a different layer opened up. Evangeline had sent this portrait in 1882. She had gone, made sure the painting was here, left a note, a sentence. When had Evangeline written this sentence? What was she thinking? On what early morning or deep night had she sat down, picked up her pen, and chosen these exact words? Cornelius couldn't know, but there was no resentment or invitation in the sentence, no punishment or forgiveness. There was only one truth, simple and clear. This past now belonged to Cornelius, because he lived within it. It was no longer Evangeline's, no longer hers, but Cornelius's. Upon reading this, something stirred within Cornelius. That heavy, shapeless thing he had carried for years shifted by a millimeter, just a millimeter. But the movement was real. The storm subsided for a moment. It didn't stop completely, but its intensity lessened, as if the wind took a short breath. In this silence, the sound of the roof changed. It was no longer the sound of a fight, but something softer, the sweet, intoxicating rhythm of snowflakes falling on wood. Cornelius breathed slowly. The attic was cold, his hands were cold, his feet were cold, but inside him there was no cold now. There was something else, hard to describe, but not unfamiliar, something he had felt once long ago and had been searching for ever since, not quite completion, but something close to completion. He folded the paper, he put it in his pocket. He looked at the portrait one last time. Evangeline, he said quietly, so no one would hear, only the emptiness of the attic. He said her name, and her name hit the roof and came back, and Cornelius took it in. Then he lifted the cover, carefully, holding each corner. He covered the portrait. He put his right hand in his pocket. The ring was still there. He had brought it with him when he left London in November 1869, and since that day he had carried it in his pocket every winter, from coat pocket to coat pocket, with the passing of the seasons. Why hadn't he thrown it away? Why hadn't he put it in a box and forgotten about it? He had never sought the answer to that question. He had simply carried it. Now he took it out of his pocket. He placed it in his palm, small, simple. Its gold band glowed dully in the dim light of the attic. This brightness had not changed despite the passing years. Gold doesn't change, after all. Only the dust on it changes, and dust can be wiped away. He squeezed the ring between his fingers. He felt the weight of the unasked question one last time, not with all his strength, but enough, and then he let go, as if leaving something inside, not dropping it, but placing it, carefully, like putting an object in its rightful place. He put the ring back in his pocket, but this time it was different. This time he carried the memory, not the pain. He picked up the lamp and walked toward the attic stairs. The floor spoke beneath each step. It made its old complaints, its weary sounds, but these sounds no longer seemed aggressive to him, just the sound of the old, the sound of everything that had been there for a long time and had become familiar. He reached the stairs. He switched the lamp to his left hand and looked at the steps, steps extending downward, continuing in darkness until the light of the hallway revealed itself. He took a step. He descended slowly, stopping at each step but without rushing. Supporting himself with his left hand on the wall, He first touched the floor with his right foot, controlling his weight. The steps complained with those familiar sounds, but they held him firmly. He stepped out into the corridor. He closed the attic door behind him. The metal mechanism clicked into place. And that sound, that small definite sound, was not the sound of closing, but of settling. The corridor had warmed up a little, or so it seemed after the cold of the attic. Cornelius paused for a moment and lifted the lamp to look down the corridor. The wall, the picture frame, the banister, everything was as it had been. Nothing had changed, but everything looked a little different. Perhaps it was the gaze that had changed, or perhaps it was the man behind the gaze. He walked slowly. He reached the top of the stairs leading down to the first floor. He held onto the banister with his right hand and looked down. Light was coming from the lower floor, the lamp in the study, the light from the last log in the fireplace, yellow and soft. The house was light. The house had waited. He descended the stairs. With each step, he moved from the cold of the hallway to the warmth of the house. It was a physical thing, the warmth gradually appearing on his skin, his fingers beginning to relax, his shoulders dropping. The study door was ajar. He had left it that way. When he left, he went inside. The fireplace was still burning. The embers were now very few, but they still gave off a red glow, and this glow was enough to keep the room warm. The area around the lamp on the desk was filled with golden light, and this light illuminated the wood of the desk, the cover of the notebook, the cooled teacup, one by one. The room was the same room, but now it felt more like home, or rather Cornelius felt more at home in it. Cornelius sat down at his desk, slowly, letting his weight settle into the chair. He leaned back. He placed his hands on the desk, flat, palms down. The storm continued outside, but it had changed. The wind was still there, but had lost its morning harshness. It no longer howled. It whispered. The snow was still falling, fine, uninterrupted, determined snow. A thin layer of ice had begun to form on the windows, and the light from the lamp reflected off this layer of ice, creating strange, beautiful patterns on the window frame, patterns no painter could have planned. Cornelius saw these. He looked at the window, watching for a while. He put his hand in his pocket. He took out the ring and placed it on the table, next to the lamp, near the notebook. It lay there, small, simple, in the light. Now Cornelius looked at it, and there was no regret or longing in him. Both still lived somewhere inside him, but they didn't come to the fore, like things that remained silently in the background. What came to the fore was something else, not exactly acceptance, but something greater, that quiet reconciliation that comes after acceptance and is broader than acceptance. That was life. It was, and it had been, and it had moved on, and it had come to this night and been left behind with this night, exactly where, who could say, but it had been left behind. He picked up the cold teacup. It was cold, completely cold, the tea inside dark and still. He looked at the cup, then he got up, took it from the table, walked out into the hallway, and headed to the kitchen. The kitchen was small and tidy, a stove, a shelf full of copper pots, cups hanging on a row of hooks nailed to the wall. Cornelius heated the water. He placed the small copper teapot on the stove and leaned against the counter, arms crossed while he waited. The stove's flame burned red and yellow. In the dark kitchen, this flame was the only light, warming not just his body, but the space itself, the wood of the countertop, the bottoms of the pots, the copper handles, the corners. The water boiled, steam rose toward the ceiling, and Cornelius took the teapot and prepared the tea. He brewed fresh tea. This time he would really drink it. He waited for it to steep. The liquid trembled slightly in the cup, the color of the tea changing from light pinkish red to dark amber. Cornelius watched these things without rushing, noticing that each stage took its own time. Patience was not a virtue in this moment. It was simply what was needed. He took the tea and returned to his study, sitting this time not at the desk, but in the small armchair near the fireplace. To the right of it, The leather surface of the chair was cold at first, but it soon warmed beneath his body. Cornelius held his tea with both hands, his fingers wrapped around the cup, and the warmth passed into his palms, and from there slowly to his wrists, his forearms. There were embers left in the fireplace. They glowed but no longer produced flames. Cornelius could have fetched some wood, revived the fire, but he didn't. The embers were enough for now. They would slowly die out. The room would gradually darken, and he realized there was something beautiful in this darkening, in every light fading in its own time, in a night closing in on itself. He took a sip of tea. It was warm and slightly sweet, fresh leaf tea, a rounded flavor, blending with the warmth descending into his stomach. It was something warming from the inside out. Not just the body, but the night itself seemed to be warming up, the walls too, the silence too. Cornelius held his tea, watching the embers in the fireplace, thinking. He thought about how that portrait had ended up in the attic, why Evangeline had sent it, why Dorothea had chosen to hoard it rather than hide it. The answers to these questions would never be fully known. Life was full of such gaps, questions that would never be answered, doors that could never be opened once closed. But there was this note, there was this sentence. The past belongs not to the sender, but to the receiver. What had Evangeline felt when she wrote that sentence? Freedom, or sadness, or both at once intertwined. Cornelius couldn't know, but the sentence itself remained, carried through the years, etched onto paper, and read tonight. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps some things in a person's life ended like this, without a grand handshake, but with a small and genuine compromise, not feeling complete but resolved. Cornelius sighed, long, slow, consciously. As he sighed, his shoulders dropped, and his neck lengthened, and his body settled a little deeper into the chair, as if every bone was finding its socket again. He looked at the ring on the table. At this distance from the lamp, it was only a small glimmer, but it was there. He didn't know what he would do with the ring tomorrow. He wouldn't throw it away. No, it would be wrong to throw away such a small and innocent object. He could put it in the chest, but putting it in the chest was like a decision he had made years ago, to make it invisible, to help forget. Perhaps he would leave it on the table. He would just leave it there, neither hiding it nor displaying it, as the quiet presence of a memory. He would see it every morning, and each day it would become a little easier to bear, until it became an ordinary object, until it finally became as ordinary, as commonplace, and as present as the silver ashtray by the fireplace. This decision comforted him, a small but real comfort. What time was it? Cornelius didn't look. He didn't want to look. He didn't need what the clock would tell him. He needed what the clock shouldn't tell him tonight. There was no clock tonight, only the storm and the fireplace, and the tea and the snow-colored light seeping in through the window. He finished his tea. He looked at the cup, a thin brown line at the bottom. He turned to the table and put the cup down and sat back down in the chair. The storm continued. The storm would continue until morning. Tomorrow the streets would be white, the roofs would be white, snow would be piled up on the garden wall, and everything would sparkle in the morning light. But now it was night. Now there was dim light and warmth and silence. That deep silence laid beneath the sound of the storm, the silence inside the house, the silence inside a person. Cornelius looked at the ring on the table one last time. Then his eyes moved elsewhere, to the fireplace grate, to the window, to the dark corner of the ceiling. He saw each one, and each one was there, and each one belonged to this night. He looked at the room, and the room looked at him, and something settled between them that night. Wordless, ceremonial, but real. He stood up, slowly, feeling his stiff joints. He went to the table and extinguished the lamp. In one movement, not thoughtlessly but habitually. The room instantly darkened. Only the last glow of the fireplace remained, very low and very calm. He walked to the door. He turned before touching the door handle. He looked at the dark room, at his desk, the chair, the ring, the last light of the fireplace. He saw them all and took them all in. He opened the door and went out. He climbed the stairs from the first floor to the second. This time he had no lamp. He held the banister with his right hand and found each step from memory. He knew this house, he had memorized it over the years and could walk through it even in the dark. The darkness of the house was no longer a foreign darkness. It was familiar, safe, his own. He reached the second floor. He opened the bedroom door. The room was cold but not unbearable. A faint light came in through the window, the blue-white light of the snow's reflection. Cornelius took off his coat. Slowly from his arms, he hung it up. He took off his shoes. He took off his jacket and placed it on the chair. He did everything slowly, step by step, without haste. The bed was cold. The blanket was cold. The pillow was cold. He lay down inside. The weight of the blanket slowly settled on him, a familiar, safe weight. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. The light coming in through the window didn't quite reach the ceiling. The room was half dark, and in this half darkness the ceiling was flat and white and silent. The sound of snow fell outside. The wind had died down now, and the snow fell silently, and this silence enveloped the whole town, all the streets, all the roofs, and Cornelius heard this silence, heard it from within his body. His eyes began to grow heavy. He carried within him what he had seen that night, the portrait, the note, the ring, the embers in the fireplace, the warmth of the tea. All of these were inside him, and all of them were slowly melting away, on the border between consciousness and sleep. And this melting was beautiful, not painful, not harsh, just slow and inevitable, and gently inviting. The past belongs not to the sender, but to the receiver. This sentence turned inside him again, and this time the turn was slower. The words drifted apart. The meaning expanded without dispersing, and expanded to envelop Cornelius. His eyes closed, and the snow continued to fall on Westhaven that night. It fell silently, steadily, and patiently onto every branch of the oak tree on Fitzwilliam Street, onto every tile of the garden wall, onto the door lintels, onto the window sills, onto everything. By morning, the town would be blanketed in white, and when the sun cast its first rays upon that whiteness, everything would sparkle. Each individual flake would sparkle, millions, billions of them, and for a moment the world would seem cleansed, renewed, stripped of all its old burdens. But it hadn't come yet. Now there was only night, only snow, and in the stone house of Westhaven, in the bedroom on the second floor, under his blanket, Cornelius Ashworth was sleeping. It wasn't a deep sleep yet. He was on the threshold, floating on that thin, velvety strip between wakefulness and sleep. He knew where he was, but the weight of his body seemed gone. The fatigue had been drawn from him, and only warmth remained, the warmth of the blanket, the warmth of the room, the soft warmth of the night. And now you are here too. Tonight, in that snowfall, in the warmth of that old house, in Cornelius's calmness on the threshold of sleep, I invite you to that place too. Let everything that happened today fade away a little. Let the light of the screen fade from your eyes. Let your thoughts flow by. Don't try to stop them. Just let them pass. Can you feel the weight of the blanket? The softness of the pillow? Your body settling a little deeper into the bed? Breathe slowly and let go. Once more, let your shoulders drop. Let the muscles in your face relax. Your forehead, around your eyes, your jaw, let go. No matter what is happening outside, you are safe tonight. There is nothing you need to do tonight. Tonight is over. Morning has not yet come, and right now, at this very moment, there is only rest. Let your thoughts fall like snow, quietly, weightlessly, from one place to another. Sleep. Sleep deeply. Good night. Deep Sleep Tales, a new story every night, each story an invitation to sleep.